Shmai pawb, hope you're having a good Brewed Wales Saturday and enjoying a drink or even maybe a cup of tea. My name is Damian Benney. I work at Penrail Comprehensive School, and this is my presentation for Brewed Wales. It's on desirable difficulties. It's a bit of a rehash of something I did for Research Ed a little while ago. So I hope you enjoy it. As I say in the video, being more aware of desirable difficulties has changed the way I think as a teacher, and I certainly would hope for the better. If you have any questions about anything in the presentation, please just ask me via Twitter. I'm at Benney Penrail, BENNEYPENYRHEOL. Pretty sure I got that right. So enjoy the video, enjoy the drink, and enjoy your Saturday. Cheers, everyone. I like the title using desirable difficulties to make learning easy, because of course it sounds like a direct contradiction. Why would you make something more difficult, and how could that possibly make learning easier? They build on the work of the Bjorks. I've got to say that when I first read the work of the Bjorks and watched some videos and been interviewed, it really did open my eyes to a lot of things and change the way that I thought about learning. So that's Robert Bjork, and that's his wife Bjork. No, not really. Sorry, forgive me that one joke. This is Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. And if nothing else from this talk, you go in and read some of their work and watch some of the videos. Their work on memory learning is just absolutely fascinating, and as I said, for me, it really opened my eyes. So this is the bit of work that I'm looking at. Making things hard on yourself, but in a good way. So it's this concept of desirable difficulties, making things more difficult to actually enhance learning. So really, I just wasn't aware of it till a couple of years ago. And they were the first people ever to sort of flag up this really important difference between learning and performance. So performance is something we can see in the here and the now. Learning, you can't see. You can only infer learning. You can really sort of infer learning from what you can see in terms of current performance. But they were the first people to say that somebody's performance could be really good. You can observe things in class, you think, well, this is just fantastic, but they actually have no impact on long-term learning. And equally, sometimes you could see performance being what seems to be quite poor, and yet it has such a positive impact on long-term learning. So this is what they say about it. And just that last sentence, I think, is particularly important. Current performance can be a highly unreliable index of whether learning has occurred. And this also is where Professor Cole came up with, linked up with the 4 proxies for learning. Now, I never thought that this was a particularly good title. I think they should have just been told not necessarily proxies for learning, because the top 1 students are busy, lots of work is done. Surely that is desirable. Students are engaged, interested, motivated again. Curriculum has been covered, classroom is ordered, calm, under control. None of those, of course, are bad things. You wouldn't want necessarily the opposite. But I think what Professor Cole and what the Bjorks would say is that none of those would actually show that long-term learning is going to take place. We've got to think a little bit differently if we're going to think about, is learning actually taking place? So it also led to, before we had Eston a couple of years ago at Penrail, our head teacher in a meeting said we're not looking to try to show progress in lessons, and in many cases this isn't desirable. And that actually sort of split staff down the middle, because a lot of staff thought that, well, how can you possibly say that to have an hour lesson? Shouldn't pupils shouldn't we be putting in an hour's worth of progress into them? But of course, the best way to sort of answer that is if you were to go into a maths class, let's call it maths class A, you've got a year 10 class who are doing trigonometry. They're on their 3rd lesson of trigonometry, but rather than just do another lesson where they're practicing a trigonometry question after another, the teacher's actually mixing things up for them. And some of the questions are on trigonometry, some are on Pythagoras, some are on area of a triangle. It's what Craig Barton would call same surface, different deep. And people would actually be struggling a little bit because they'd have to differentiate which ones are trigonometry, which ones are Pythagoras, which ones are area of a triangle, and their performance might actually be inhibited. You go to the next, so you leave after an hour, and the pupils haven't done particularly well, they've struggled, they've made lots of errors. So you go to the next classroom next door for the next hour, and the teacher's doing their, again, similar class, the teacher's doing their 3rd lesson on trigonometry. This time they're just doing practice after practice after practice of trigonometry, the pupils would be doing far better. They'd be getting far more of the questions right. And it's easy to walk out of that second lesson thinking, well, that teacher's much better than the first teacher. Those pupils are doing much better than the first lot of pupils. But actually, if you were to test the pupils a month later on trigonometry, it's very likely that the pupils in classroom A with a poorer performance would actually do better. So evidence that sometimes if you can inhibit performance, make short-term performance worse, you can actually get gains in long-term learning. But the key to the work of the Bjorks is that the desirables, the difficulties have got to be desirable. You can't just make things work impossibly rock hard for students and that's it. It's just not as simple as that. So a desirable difficulty is desirable because, well, there we are. It says there. So the two things that I'm going to look at, when I look at them together, they're not the same thing, but they are linked. The first is the spacing effect. This is probably the oldest bit of educational research that there's ever been. This is Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. And it shows, as we know, that when people learn something, they start to forget it almost straight away. And we've got to come back to that piece of learning, a number of times. What I would like to draw your attention to, though, is that the rate of decay after each review is shallower. So you don't forget as quickly. And I think that's really important to actually understand the cognitive science behind that. And the second bit of desirable difficulties is retrieval practice. And retrieval practice literally means remembering something you were previously taught. For it to be true retrieval practice, there has to have been some delay since you were first taught it. So it's not as simple as parroting back something at the end of the lesson and saying, yeah, that's retrieval practice. Well, no, it's not. There has to be some sort of delay. So retrieval practice is difficult because you're asking students to remember something you previously taught them. It could be a week ago, a month ago, or even 6 months ago, or even longer. So obviously it's difficult, but it's a desirable difficulty. If they're able to remember it correctly, then that memory is more retrievable in the future. And there's like loads and loads of research on both spacing and retrieval practice. This is possibly one of the most famous ones, just to compare group 1 and group 3. So group 1 studied the text, then they restudied it, and then they did a final test. So it's very much like having a class of students, teaching them something, and then teaching it to them again and again and again, and then giving them a test. Compared to group 3, who studied a text, but then were tested on it. They were tested on it again, and then they had their final test. And if you look at the graph to the right-hand side, the one that I'm not blanking out, after a week's delay, the study group did far worse than the study test group. So it just shows this is the generative effect, the testing effect. This is retrieval practice this just shows how powerful it is for long-term learning. And I think the important thing also to point out here is that the students in the group 3, when they sat their final test, they probably felt the least confident about doing well on their final test, and probably the study group probably felt the most confident, because, and the thing with difficulties is it's counterintuitive. If you're getting students to struggle on something, they'll feel like they're not doing so well. So whenever you're using desirable difficulties for students, I think it actually helps to talk them through the theory of it, so they know why you're asking them to do work which is hard and not just reteaching them. And I think it's a really important point. And retrieval practice works because every time a memory is retrieved, that memory becomes more accessible in the future. So that's what I tell my students whenever we do retrieval practice. Every single lesson, it's hard, it's difficult. The reason we do it, though, is if they can remember something correctly, that memory becomes more accessible in the future. And before I just look at how I use retrieval and spacing strategies, I just want to go into the cognitive science a little bit more, because I just think it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm just going to look at this post by Veronica Yan, which was done on the Learning Scientist. And this purely builds on the work of the Bjorks, and it's this idea now that memory is, as most of us would probably think, it's not on one single continuum from remembered right down to completely and utterly forgotten. But actually, Bjork's theory is that it's called the new theory of disuse. That whenever we learn something new, it doesn't sit somewhere on the continuum between remembered and forgotten, but it actually has two strengths. So it's stored in the brain, but it has two strengths. It has a retrieval strength and a storage strength. And understanding what those mean and how they interact, I think, is really important to understanding why spaced retrieval practice works so effectively. So what we've got is we've got retrieval strength and we've got storage strength. So whenever you learn something new, it will sit somewhere on that graph. It will have a certain retrieval strength and it will have a certain storage strength. And there's 5 things that we really need to understand about retrieval strength and storage strength. Now, retrieval strength you can measure, you can observe. It's how easy it is for somebody to actually, to retrieve something from their, from their memory. So retrieval strength, I think, is very much analogous to performance. Whereas storage strength, you can't measure storage strength. We want the goal of all our instruction is to make as much of what we teach to have high storage strength as we possibly can. That's what we want, is everything we teach our students to end up long term to have a really, really high storage strength in their long term memory. So retrieval strength you can measure, it's analogous to performance, but storage strength you can't, you can only infer it. And I think storage strength is analogous to learning. Now, these 5 things that we need to understand. The first one is that retrieval strength should always start on high. Whenever you taught someone, they should be able to repeat back to you, what's the capital of France, Paris. They should be able to repeat that back, without too many problems. But what retrieval strength does is it decays and it goes from right to left. So it will start high, but it will decay and it will go towards the left. And eventually, if we're not careful, retrieval strength will hit 0 and we won't be able to retrieve it. Storage strength, and that's the first thing. The second thing is that storage strength does not decrease. So when a bit of knowledge or a concept has a high storage strength, that storage strength will not decrease. It won't go down, it can only go up. And that's the second thing. The third thing is a really interesting point. I'm going to come back to that in a second. We compare these two. So imagine now that the top one is student A and the bottom one is student B. We're teaching these 2 students exactly the same nugget of knowledge during a lesson. And student A has, it's at the top. So they're learning this new bit of knowledge with a high storage strength and a high retrieval strength. Student B has got a high retrieval strength as well, but a low storage strength. Now, as we said, both of those retrieval strengths are going to decay. Okay, so as we said earlier. But what's interesting is that the student with the highest storage strength, their retrieval strength will decay slower. So both dots will move from the right of the graph to the left of the graph. But the person with the highest storage strength, that bit of knowledge, the retrieval strength of it will decay much, much slower than student B. Now, why is that? I think this is really, really important as well. Student A has got a higher storage strength than student B because he or she is learning something and it has a rich association with background knowledge. There's lots of associated links with knowledge that's already stored in their long-term memory, whereas student B has not got a great deal of background knowledge, hasn't got a great deal of knowledge to knit this new bit of knowledge onto. So student A is, we call that person really clever, and this is where the Matthew effect takes place, because this just shows why those people who know lots find future learning so much easier. It's because they build up their beautiful schema because they've always got they've always got those webs to build it into. Student B doesn't have those. Now, as we said, student B's retrieval strength will decay much, much quicker than student A's retrieval strength. They both reach 0 in the end. And this is the fourth bit, which is really, really important. The student with high storage strength, even if that retrieval strength goes all the way down and hits the 0, so storage strength is still high, but retrieval strength is 0, that knowledge, that concept, whatever it may be with a high storage strength, is easily relearned. So it maybe takes 5 minutes of prompting, of reteaching certain parts of it, and all of a sudden they could remember maybe 3 hours of content, and it will shoot back up to having high retrieval strength. Whereas the person with the low retrieval strength, so this person, is this going to work? This person here, they're going to go down really, really quickly. Their retrieval strength is going to drop far, far quicker, and this person up here, in the same time, that person might be down to there. And once that person has forgotten, once person B has forgotten everything, once their retrieval strength has dropped down to 0, which is what we mean when they can't remember it, they can't easily relearn it. So 3 hours of content will have to be retaught over 3 hours. So this is the Matthew effect in action. Those with lots of background knowledge, those kids we would call clever, do lots of reading, whatever it may be, they just find future learning so much easier. just to go back to give a brief example, maybe I should have done this previously. Just to give 2 examples of what we mean by bits of knowledge having different retrieval strength and different storage strength. Probably I'm going to come off this because I don't need to read it while I'm going through it. But for instance, I went to Cyprus on holiday with my family last year, and the hotel room number at the time would have had a high retrieval strength but low storage strength, because I was going back there every day. I knew which room number I was going to. Now, 8 months later, I've got absolutely no idea what the room number was. So it had high retrieval strength during the holiday, but that has quickly dropped down. So I would have had, for that room number, it would have landed about here, and it would have been kept high during because I've been going back to the hotel room. But very, very quickly, I've come back from a holiday, it's dropped down here, and you know what? I can't relearn it. I could, if it's something between 1 and 100, I could read, I could go through every single number, 1 to 100. I couldn't relearn it because it had low storage strength to begin with. Whereas the postcode of the house that I grew up in for many years ago in Dunland would have been originally up here. When I moved out to live with my now wife, the storage strength of it dropped, and actually I couldn't remember the postcode the other day, and my wife just said, "Oh, it's 782," and straight away it came up here, SA2 7UQ. I remembered it, and again, so just showing how easily something with high storage strength can be easily relearned. So again, what we're talking about for pupil A and pupil B is pupil A has got these beautiful schema in their heads. So whenever they're learning something new, they can just knit it into it. So they just get more cleverer and cleverer. And person B, if we go back to person B down here, person B is just experiencing the curriculum. They're not able to build on prior learning. And you know, if nothing else, what we've got to think about is how we can make sure that whenever we teach something in a classroom today, how do we get that bit of knowledge to have as high storage strength as we possibly can? So just another example of a schema. This is work from Gareth Rain, head teacher from a school in Wales. I just think it beautifully shows up as a visual representation of a schema. This is what he'd like his pupils to learn about a tree as they go through primary school. It was absolutely fantastic representation of that. And the fifth thing about retrieval strength and storage strength is, again, to do with their interaction. So just to sum up, just to recap, retrieval strength will decay. It'll go from right to left. Storage strength will not decay. It will only ever go upwards. The higher the storage strength, the slower the decay of retrieval strength. The higher the storage strength, the easier it is for that bit of knowledge to be relearned. So that's the 4 things so far. But the 5th thing is, how does storage strength and retrieval strength change when somebody actually does some retrieval practice? And this is where, again, it gets really, really fascinating. If we look to at the 2 dots and 2 arrows on the right-hand side of the graph, we're asking somebody or 2 pupils to retrieve something when retrieval strength is high. So this could be at the end of a lesson during a plenary. So because it's easily retrieved, they're able to retrieve it successfully, and they get a tiny boost in storage strength and retrieval strength. Now, if we look at the 2 dots on the left, the goal of spacing is to allow a period of time for forgetting. Now, a lot of people think forgetting is our enemy, and it can be, but actually we need to harness the power of forgetting. Because if we can let our students start to forget stuff that we've taught them, their retrieval strength will drop. It will go from high to low. Now, the key here, and Barry Mock summed it up beautifully, he said it's about having the right size gap, the right size pause to have that boost. What you need to do is you need to allow pupils time to forget, and then you need to get them to retrieve that information when retrieval strength is low, not 0, but low. Because if they can do that successfully, they will have a massive boost in storage strength and a massive boost in retrieval strength. And the important thing is that boost in storage strength, because it means that bit of information is going to, that nugget of knowledge is going to decay more slowly in terms of its retrieval strength, but it's going to have a high storage strength. So even if in future it is forgotten again, it's far more easier for them to relearn it because of its high storage strength. Now, that doesn't mean that if we can get person B to have that big boost, as we'd see in the bottom left arrow, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden they can have a beautiful schema, but it means that that nugget of knowledge is going to be more accessible in the future so they can build future learning on it, so they can build a schema around that bit of knowledge. So what we have to do is we have to try to allow our students to forget. We have to allow retrieval strength to decrease. We need to get them to retrieve something successfully, and then we get that massive boost in retrieval strength, and more importantly, in storage strength. So when we do a planning at the end of the lesson and pupils are repeating stuff back to us, that's great for checking for understanding. And I think during lessons, whenever we do check for understanding, that's really important. People's not picking up misconceptions. But what we can do is, if we can just allow them time to forget, we get this massive boost in storage strength and retrieval strength. And this is where spaced retrieval practice comes in. Now, I've written a couple of blogs over the last couple of years as to various ways I've tried to incorporate this into my classroom. I'll just go through what I sort of currently do now. I just want to flag one thing up though. When we look at the spacing effect, when we review the information here, we get a slower decay of forgetting. And I think what's important here is how we review that knowledge. We should always think about the spacing effect, coming hand in hand with retrieval practice. So when we revisit here, as we've seen from the research earlier, we don't want to just be reteaching the students the knowledge here. We want to get them to retrieve it. Because what that will actually do then is we will get a slower decay of forgetting. And the reason we get a slower decay of forgetting is if we can get students to successfully remember something, they get that boost in storage strength, they get that boost in retrieval strength, and the retrieval strength will decay more slowly, which is why the shape of this isn't like that, the same as there. You actually get a slower decay. It's because that knowledge has had a boost in storage strength, so it decays, so its retrieval strength decays more slowly. So this is a bit where it gets really difficult, because the optimal time to test someone is when they're on the verge of forgetting, and it's absolutely impossible to see because you can't see inside your students' heads. But that is the reality. So I was lucky enough to be sent an academic paper which explored the very concept of when is the best time to revisit previously learned information. And it was this article here, Spacing Effects in Learning. And it was a fascinating read. It was quite challenging for me to read it. It was, I didn't have all the background knowledge I needed to understand it, and it took me a little while, and I had to ask some people's advice. But what it came up to is what I was expecting to find out is that if you think about finishing a concept today, and then having a gap, and then having some sort of final study session, some sort of test. So for instance, I finished teaching a lesson today. I'm thinking, right, I'm going to leave a gap before I revisit the work, get the kids to do some retrieval practice, and then how long should my gap be the other side to their actual test? And what I was expecting, what they called it in the paper was they called it the gap, which is obviously the gap between coming back to the same materials, and then the other side of the gap to the from the restudy, or it should be retrieval, to the final test was the retention interval. How long did pupils have to retain that information for? And when I first started reading it, I expected there to be some sort of golden ratio. I expected there to be like maybe a ratio of 1 to 3. So if your initial study session and your final test was 100 days, then maybe the gap would be 25 days and the retention interval would be 75 days, and that golden ratio would stay the same. But it actually didn't. That was really interesting. The size of the gap, and therefore the size of the retention interval, changed depending on the gap between the initial study session and the final test on the material. So I came up with this graph, which I've been using now for a couple of years. The idea behind this graph is you from the day you finish teaching a topic, you measure out the time to the end of the study. When's your test, when's your exam, and then from that, on the y-axis, then you can find out when is the optimal time to restudy the information or revisit the information. And again, all of this is based on the data from that article. So I knocked these sort of things up. And that's what they look like. And I also made some spacing grids. So I need to think about what my students will be doing on the day that we actually want to revisit this information. I don't want to spend half a lesson reteaching everything. I want them to do retrieval practice. We just made a load of retrieval grids, and students would have to do them from memory. They do them in one colour, and then I go through it and they'd add anything they missed in a different colour. Students hated these, if truth be told, these retrieval grids, spacing grids. But they knew why we were doing them. And again, it's like it's a desirable difficulty. It's difficult, yes, you're going to struggle. It's no fun. It's not as much fun as you sitting there half hour while I reteach it. it's hard, but it'll actually really benefit you in your long-term learning. Students could, they bought into that and were happy is the wrong word, but they were happy to do these bits of work during certain lessons. So the way it worked is this. I'd finish scientific detection, for instance, on September the 28th. And I'd work out how many days I had left until the exam, 245 as example here. And then on the graph, okay, there was 70 odd days to the mock, but more importantly, there was 245 days until their Year 11 GCSE exam. And that would tell me that the best time to revisit that topic that I finished teaching them on September the 28th was 21 days later. Now that might seem a bit, a bit mental in a sense. So you've got 250 days until the exam. You're going to wait maybe 21 days to revisit that information, and that sort of leaves a whopping 229 days of retention interval. It just seems crazy. On the face of it, you might think, well, why don't we just wait 100 days, revisit it, and then that only leaves us a retention interval 150 days to the side. I think the point there is that if you leave it 100 days, then no matter who your students are, their retrieval strength is going to go down to 0, and they won't be able to retrieve anything. You're going to have to end up reteaching it all. Okay, the ones who've got high storage strength in the first place are going to be at a massive advantage because they relearn it easier. So I think the idea of 21 days is the ideal time to leave that, to allow the forgetting, and to allow a smaller possible retention interval. So that's what I tried. And again, a topic like controlling processes, I finished on the 12th of February, exactly the same principle, how long to the exam. And again, so 108 days, I need to revisit this in about 13 days. So my initial gap is a little bit smaller because I've got a smaller retention interval the other side. But again, the ratio isn't the same. And again, this is just what it looked like. And the results I had in the first of doing it were probably the results that I've been most proud of up to that point in my teaching career. They were noticeably better than I expected. I'm not going to go into it too much, but since using spaced retrieval practice, I think my results have been far better than they ever were before. So the other thing probably worth pointing out is that I spent the last couple of years thinking hard about what the optimal spacing gap is, but the reality is there isn't an optimal spacing gap, because if you're teaching 30 students and they're all sitting down in front of you, when you teach them something, that knowledge is going to have a different story strength for every single one of them, depending on their background knowledge, something you can't control on that day in your classroom. So they're all going to, that knowledge is going to decay, their retrieval strength is going to decay at different rates, not at the same rate. But what I found from using the graph is that it was a really, really good best bet, because whenever we used them, nobody could retrieve absolutely everything. Nobody could retrieve nothing at all. And there was a good, everybody could retrieve something. So there is no such thing as an optimal spacing gap for a class. There isn't even an optimal spacing gap for a student, because when you then teach them a different topic, they'll have different background knowledge, they'll have different story strength. So the story strength will also, their retrieval strength will also decay at a different rate than maybe the previous topic. But the graph I came up with, to me, is a really, really good best bet on what the optimal spacing graph should be for a sort of mixed up, a mixed attainment group then. So really briefly, I think I've really got time to go into this, but I just explored briefly in another blog, built on a brilliant work by Tom Meader. Where does desirable difficulties fit into, direct instruction, explicit instruction, cognitive load theory? Cognitive load theory is all about keeping things as clean and simple as possible. And I think the key here, I'm not going to go into this, but desirable difficulties, you don't introduce them into the first stage of teaching. The desirable difficulties come in later on. So if you want to look at that, please pause it, but I have to move on because this time is really short. So what we've really got to think about as teachers is, if I'm teaching a Year 11 class, how can I make sure that what I teach them today lands with as high a story strength as I possibly can? And the reality is, obviously I'm going to try to activate the prior knowledge and knit it into that, but I can't control how much prior knowledge they've got. So what we need to do is we need to think about what goes on lower down the school. What goes on, what do we teach them, what retrieval and spaced practice do we use lower down the school, so people are actually coming into my Year 11 classroom with as much background knowledge as they possibly can. Do we just let the kids forget everything they ever did in Key Stage 3 and start again? That's just crazy. How much this is the sort of challenge for us as educators, I think, is going through school from the very day they start in school to the day they sit in the Year 11 classroom. how can we ensure that they bring as much background knowledge into your classrooms as they possibly can? Because this, we've got to make sure the Matthew effect works for all our students, that students know as much background knowledge as possible when they sit down in your classroom. So they've got whatever you're teaching today, they've got that to build into it. And their retrieval strength will decay really, really slowly. And their storage strength, because it's high, it means that it's easy relearned. So again, it's just about building being able to build those schema successfully for our students. So over the last 2 years, I've sort of tidied up my routine a little bit. I still use the graph at the end of every topic. I still use the graph, and then at a certain time later, I'll use the spacing grids. But I also use this amazing resource by Adam Boxer, his Retrieval Roulette. Now, I have written, time is really, really short now, I've rabbled on far too much. I have written a blog recently that went on the Concepts Symposium about how I use Adam Boxer's Retrieval Roulette. But this is just a fantastic resource for retrieval practice and also for spaced retrieval practice as well, because what happens is pupils come in and they have 3 questions from the current topic, which is all about building schema, and 3 questions from previously learned topics. I do put a bit of a tweak on it, and I make sure that once the topic is finished, that the questions on the topic we've just finished don't appear in Retrieval Roulette until we've done the spaced the spaced retrieval grid. But again, I'll let you read that if you're interested. Again, it's just a fantastic resource. I just haven't got time to go through this now, I'm afraid. What I basically do is I finish teaching a topic. I work out. Sorry, it goes so well, doesn't it? Okay, I finish teaching a topic. Then the questions on that topic disappear from the Retrieval Roulette. I give time for forgetting. Then I use the graph to work out when is the optimal time to revisit that. My people will do a spacing grid, and once they've done that spacing grid, those questions then will appear back in the Retrieval Roulette. But what I need to happen is I need to have a gap. I need to allow them to forget before I ask them to retrieve retrieve again. Because what I don't want is I don't want those sort of this. I don't want to ask them finish the topic and then ask them every single lesson for the next 10 lessons about something they just learned, because you're not going to get that boost in retrieval and storage strength. And when you do then give them time to forget, they're just going to forget it really quickly, and you've wasted your time. So just doing that, make sure that they do actually, I give them time to forget. I give them time for the retrieval strength to drop low, not to 0, but to drop low before asking them to retrieve it through the grids. And then those questions can go back into the Retrieval Roulette. And the other brilliant thing about Retrieval Roulette is you can just drop the questions into something like Quizlet. So it's a big task setting up the Retrieval Roulette. On Adam's website, there's loads of available, ready-made, fantastic. What you can do is you can just drop them into Quizlet, and students have got ready-made sort of flashcards based on exactly the same questions that have been on the Retrieval Roulette, which they do daily. So I'm not sure if I explained the Retrieval Roulette particularly well, but students will come in every single lesson and they'll have 3 questions on the current topic and 3 questions, 3 randomly selected questions on any of the previous topics. 6 questions every lesson, great routine to get into. Students enjoy it, they find it easy, especially the 3 older questions, and they get so much confidence from getting things right. When you're in February, March, and they're getting stuff right back September, October, it's just fantastic, fills them with confidence. And I think it actually makes them more likely to revise because they feel they've got a great, they've got a great background to start building on, not starting from scratch. So just to finish, thank you for listening. Further reading, I really think you should listen to the Mr. Barton Maths podcast. His interview with Robert and Elizabeth Bjork's just absolutely phenomenal. Listening to them talk with such passion, great questions from Craig, but amazing answers from the 2 of them. And it will just, for me, they will just open my eyes, the difference between performance and learning, and the importance of spaced retrieval practice to make sure that students build schema, make future learning as easy as we possibly can by making what we teach them today more accessible in the future. So thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed it and it's been of some use. I've got a blog, Mr. Benney, just Google Mr. Benney, one word, MRBENNEY. And a lot of this is sort of already in the blog, but I hope you enjoyed the Research Ed talk. Thank you. Goodbye.